welcome to the first ever book club meeting live here on twitch.tv/Flimaverse. Very excited to have you. This is our book club, right? We sit down and we gab about books that we're reading about. We have friends on. Today we have some really exciting people to join us. I'm very excited to talk about V for Vendetta. By Alan Moore and David Lloyd. Before we do that, though, I'd like to, if I can, introduce some people who we have joining us. The first that I'll start with is Mr. Benjamin Bobby from the Brotherhood of Batman podcast. His disembodied voice is here. Bobby, Ben, how you doing?
That was a beautiful introduction. I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. I'm excited to talk some V for Vendetta. We also have with us, and if you want to introduce yourself, feel free. Oh, also, we'll do that later. I also have with us, we have Sleep Easy. How you doing, Sleep?
Howdy, y'all.
What's
up?
What's
the
up?
book club is up, and we're doing it today. So
exciting stuff. We also have a Mr. Alex Burton joining us today. How you doing, Alex?
I'm good. Thank you
Awesome.
for blasting all of my details on the internet.
Yeah. Your social security number is this. Yes. Your blood type, absolutely. I make sure I give everybody everything they need.
100%. Give them everything.
We also have a family member of Sleep, Z, is here with us. I would try to pronounce their name. You'll see in a moment. But how you doing, Z?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. Can you pronounce for me what your username is?
Zaraleda.
That's awesome. Okay, cool. I'll remember that, and then I'll forget it, and then I'll remember it again 6 months from now.
Z's easier.
Z is so much easier. We're gonna roll with Z today. But yes, I'm excited to have you guys on. So again, book club. Very excited to jump into V for Vendetta
as well.
Yes, and that's we got Cryptic in the chat right now. But yeah, the whole idea of book club is for us to talk. We're going to talk in this Discord voice chat. If you're on the Discord with us right now, you can join it at any time. Otherwise, feel free to hop in and chat, ask questions, discuss things if you'd like to, add some topics of conversation for us. We're going to kind of dive into our thoughts, though. So I'm going to go ahead and move along to our little handy doodad here. So now, we're officially going to get it started. And so the way I want to kind of just get the ball rolling is ask everyone around the metaphorical table, as it were, a little bit about your first impressions, if this is the first time that you read this book or experienced the book in the movie or what have you. And if it's not the first time, I'd like to see like what your first impressions were when you did read it that first time. And then like if that's changed on the second or third or whatever time you've read this would be this time, if that makes sense. So I will start myself and kind of set the tone a little bit and kind of help with that if that's all right. So this was my first time reading V for Vendetta, watching the movie, all that stuff. I thought it was obviously very engrossing and very nerve-wracking with the parallels that you can draw to what's happening in the real world right now. I won't go into that too much because I'm sure we'll talk about that in great detail, but I very much enjoyed it. I thought it was like I said, an engrossing read. I read through it pretty quickly, and I liked it quite a bit. That's really kind of just my first impressions and thoughts, right? I mean, I think it's dark. I think it's what's the word I'm looking for? Relevant, I guess, to the times we're living in now in a lot of very scary ways. And also as someone who grew up hyper evangelical Christian, there were a lot of things that I saw like parallels to things in novels that I was reading at the time in that echo chamber where they're trying to manufacture the same kind of feelings and persecution and all of that's going on. That I think was interesting, but I'll talk more about that later if we want to. But that's a little bit of my first impressions, and then I'll just kind of go ahead and go straight to you, Ben, and ask first of all: is this the first time that you've read this, or have you read this before?
So this is the first time that I've read this.
Okay.
When Sleep Easy asked me if I would like to be a part of this, I was like, oh, great. I have someone in my family I can borrow that from.
Nice.
And my first thought was, ooh, Natalie Portman. And then I remembered that my experience with the movie was canoodling in a college bunk. So I do not remember the movie either.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Okay.
good times.
Okay.
Good
That's
times.
a topic for another time. But so So you don't. So there wasn't a whole. Sorry, I'm distracted by it. Right, I got lost in in your story there. So
Exactly. So
right.
for the book,
Yes.
I was excited to pick it up. It's definitely not the genre I typically read. I read a lot of lighthearted, more young adult, kind of superhero comedy things.
Okay.
So I was excited for something completely different. I obviously wanted to look at the date immediately because I want to know the world I'm reading, so I'm not just feeling like it's very dated.
Sure.
There were some things with like the art style and such where I got a little confused, a little lost. This was not a fast read for me, but
Okay.
overall, I definitely felt the importance of what it's done for comic books and just the fact that it's still relevant today, as you said.
Sure. Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you. What about you? I'm going to go just straight down the line of the people that I see on these icons. For you, Burton, what were like your first impressions? What did you think of V for Vendetta?
Yeah, so I've watched the movie a few times in my life, and never read the book. I actually was really confused when I got the book because I'd ordered it, and then I got it, and then I had up sleep and was like, "Hey, this is a visual novel. What's going on here?" Like I thought this was like a book, and yeah, I definitely
Hey, I just want to
agree.
interject real quick. Graphic novels
Yeah.
are books, so
Oh yeah, no,
let's just
no, I
watch the graphic
agree.
novel slander. All right, no, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fighting words.
Fair
over
enough.
here.
Fair
Right
enough.
on.
No, I love comic books. So I was very excited because this is like my type of thing. I was very happy. I shouldn't say happy, but I like when books have a darker, more realistic tone, and kind of like you already said, Flemma, the parallels that you can draw, especially in the last, like I would say, 10 years, that you can draw from the content that is in the book in comparison to what's actually happening in our society. It's just it is just aged like a fine wine. So that's my impression.
I think I agree 100% on that for sure. What about you, Sleep? What were your first impressions? Had you read this before? Actually, let me ask you that.
I thought I had read it before,
Okay.
but after reading it, I don't think that I actually had. And thank goodness it wasn't one of those. And I'm not taking shots at anyone because I know that lots of people own this book. But thank goodness it wasn't one of those ones that I had on my shelf and hadn't read yet. But now that I have read it, it will be on my shelf. I'm not going to sit here and echo what you all said, but it is very true. I also, hello, Cryptic.
Rocket's here too. That's exciting.
So one of the things that I will say is that I read this in tandem with other books. I read it in tandem with How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley. And holy cow, what a mutual read that was, because they echoed each other. So really, I wish I could recommend doing that, but I don't know. Not everyone is down to reading more than one book at one time, and not everyone can do it. But yeah, if you can, do it. So yeah, as far as fascism is concerned, I think it is an ongoing topic since 1983 to 2023, and it's something we're going to continue to deal with. So
absolutely. Okay. Awesome. Thank you for that. And I also want to I want to dive into that a little bit more later whenever we're talking about the fascist overtones, obviously the fascist part of the book itself, because reading that in conjunction at the same time, I really want to know a little bit more about that perspective for sure.
Yeah, I'm also someone who loves that old school art, and I know some of it was kind of hard to see, but I did also like there was some nice cherries in there, some hidden Easter eggs in the artwork, which I really like.
Sure, absolutely. Z, what about you? What were your thoughts?
So I have a confession.
Yeah.
I have never read this.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Two, I didn't realize this was a graphic novel until like 5 minutes ago.
Awesome. Hey, that's all right. That's all right.
Oh, man.
But I was like super obsessed with the movie, so I'm adding this to the list, and we'll see how different they are. I'm excited.
Oh, yeah. I definitely think that it's well worth the read for sure. And the difference is, I mean, there are some very key differences, but there are some moments that they do, I think, recreate pretty well, or some feelings at least that they evoke that I think they're really well done. But yeah, Okay, cool. Well, that's awesome. So that's actually also an interesting perspective to bring into this while we're talking about this, because there may be things that we say that are in the graphic novel that we noticed, or things that were talked about or focused on that may not have had that same kind of focus in the movie. So anytime you notice that or see anything you want to speak to, let us know, because I'd love to hear that perspective.
Definitely.
For sure. Rocket, welcome in, my friend. What were your thoughts about V for Vendetta?
Well, this is my first time reading the novel. I had seen the movie years and years ago.
Sure.
And general, it just, as the saying goes, the more things change, the more things stay the same. It's like a lot of the criticisms and critiques and commentary more was going for when writing this in the 80s feels and a lot of Moore's motive of this from Moore's perspective in the 80s was a response to British politics at the time, specifically Margaret Thatcher. And here we are all these decades later, and it's like, nothing's changed. If anything, things have gotten worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree, and that's actually a good segue, I think, into one of the first topics that I wanted to talk about when it comes to this book, because I felt like it was going to be something that we all had a consensus about, and that is, the parallels that have to do with reality today, right? And so Sleep was so generous as to send me a like a study guide, essentially, right, with questions that you would ask in like a classroom setting. And I thought, how perfect is that for a book club? So thank you for that resource there, Sleep. But I think one of the questions in there in particular had to center around technology, right? And Sleep and I were kind of talking about this a little bit earlier before we started here. It's insane, to think about how much. When I actually want to ask you guys, I'm not going to go off on my own thing. I'm going to start with you, Ben. I want to ask, like, when you look at the technology we have today compared to how the graphic novel ended, with how much, they're watching every move we make, they're anticipating the things that we're going to do, all of these Big Brother-esque type of conversations. What are your thoughts about that? I guess just like kind of a knee-jerk reaction.
Well, I love the show Big Brother, so there you go.
Sure. Absolutely.
Just kidding. I think it's funny that we're talking about technology while I'm at least on my cell phone, and so there's the whole aspect of the apps and what data are you giving up, and then there's a bunch of people who are, of course, I don't want to give up any data, but it's like if you have a phone, they can watch you, and kind of goes to the whole vaccine microchip situation. So I thought it was interesting that not much has changed in 40 years.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, if anything, they have to use in the novel ends with like, different cameras being set up to like watch people and stuff. But like the thing that really got me is we're holding every resource that they need in order to be able to anticipate. I mean, they're already using and anticipating our wants when it comes to advertisements on, whatever application or website you're using, like you're saying, whatever permissions you give them. They're already making these recommendations, and in a way that seems docile, seems harmless, but could so very quickly be used. If there was some sort of revolutionary behavior in especially in America, right, I think that it would be so much easier for them to try to use our information against us and squash something like that, any sort of that, kind of uprising or what have you. And I think that that's scary, and makes it seem that much more intimidating for something, for someone who may want to try to, enact some sort of revolutionary behavior. Does anybody have any thoughts? Anybody else have any thoughts about that in particular, like when it comes to the technology we have today? That's absolutely all right if not. So we can actually move right along for sure as well. So, that was a big thing that I feel like was an interesting part of the conversation. But another part of it that really kind of got me, and again, talking about the parallels when it comes to what we're looking at in reality today, is we had our own pandemic, right? I mean, I don't know if you guys remember or not, huge, big COVID thing. I don't know if you guys are familiar or not, but
we are in season 3 of 2020.
We are. Yeah. We absolutely are. And you see all these organizations, these companies with record-breaking profits, right? They're making money hand over fist, and they're refusing to pay their employees. They're doing a lot of things that should, enact some sort of urge, and I think that they have to a certain degree, for us to try to change the system. We know that it's broken. We know we need to do more. But the fact that they have hoarded all of this wealth, and could create this fascist police, an even worse fascist police state, one that is more akin to the novel, was even more terrifying in my eyes. Now, Sleep, what are your thoughts about something about that, right? That kind of parallel that we're dealing with now versus
the parallel with fascism?
Yeah. Well, talk to me about it.
Well, as someone who fancies himself an anarchist, I loved the juxtaposition between the two, and I not that I would relate to V, but I understand his perspective a lot with some of this. Going through some of the fascist leanings, it seemed like I talked about. I happened to read How Fascism Works at the same time, so pointing out some of these parallels. It wasn't just Alan Moore saying, I don't like these people because of X, Y, and Z. Whenever I read How Fascism Works, there is, a particular political bent, as we saw in one of the very first pages of V for Vendetta. It was kind of, it gave me goosebumps, not to ruin anything for anyone who hasn't read it, but there is a quote that says, make Britain great again, right in one of the very first pages. This was published in 1983.
Yes.
And I can't tell if someone, grabbed that particular, grabbed it as a joke or grabbed it as for some other reason, but it gave me chills, and I was just like, oh, okay, so that's how this is going to go.
Right.
Yeah, and I think as far as the book has other aspects to it, but the fascism part is very. Alan Moore doesn't mince words in what he's trying to create a universe or whatever, and he very much in this graphic novel beats you over the head with a lot of different stuff. He is also a famous anarchist, so listening to his words outside of these novels is very interesting as well. But he uses his words very directly in this to try to get a point across, right? So that's what I'll kind of say about it. I also, let me hold on. There was a James Baldwin quote, so let me get to this.
You go ahead. Do you have it on you right now?
Yes, I do.
Oh, go. Yeah.
In the graphic novel, V is called a terrorist by the fascist government. And so this James Baldwin quote, he's talking about Palestine, but I think it kind of hits the nail on the head with when we're talking about fascism and terrorists and anarchists and all this stuff. So the James Baldwin quote is, a terrorist is called that only because he does not have the power of the state behind him. Indeed, he has no state, which is why he is a terrorist. The state, at bottom, and when the chips are down, rules... Wait, hold. Let me start the sentence over again. The state at bottom, and when the chips are down, rules by means of terror made legal. So that's kind of saying hey, if you want to look at this from a different perspective, you could say that the state or the government is the terrorist because they're, doing certain things to the people, whether it's killing them like what the Nazis wanted to do, or this quote is talking about Palestine, right? So you have the Israeli government killing Palestinian people. So, calling someone a terrorist, sometimes in the case of V, they're trying to stand up for their particular ethical or, freeing other people as a stance. But then you have a strong arm kind of governmental entity in V for Vendetta where they're trying to do specific things, and I hate to equate, go full Godwin's law here and say everything's a Nazi, but in the book V for Vendetta, they are very Nazi-esque. They are clearly fascist. which is why V is trying to stand up to them, not only because of his personal experience with them, which I guess we can get into in a little bit, but because of what they stand for. You know, they're trying to get rid of minorities in many different ways, you know, and some of the colorful language that is used to describe them in the graphic novel as well.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. I love that quote too. I think another thing that, you know, is pretty obvious, a conversation that centers around this quite often you see is that conversation about like Hobbes and Locke and the social contract, right? That philosophical debate that they have where, you know, you had, I'm looking to make sure that I get this right because I don't want to mix them up, but you had Hobbes, who was a proponent of like absolutism, meaning that we needed to have some sort of like monarch, or we needed to have someone that made the rules, and everybody was, we had this sense of like everyone was meant to or was made to inherently follow a one type of person and kind of be followers, right, of that leadership. I'm definitely butchering the philosophy of it itself, I'm sure, but then you also had the opposite where Locke was far more like individualistic in the sense that, you know, this agreement that we make is individuals coming together, and that there needs to be more of a, you know, focus on the consensus of the people itself, right? And that's obviously a big theme that you see in this book, right? Is that you see just how much the people who are in charge act as if and try to force down others' throats, say, you need us in order for society to be successful. But the reality is those people need the consent of the people who they are governing in order to actually, you know, get things done and actually make things happen. And I think that that's, you know, like, again, we talk about these parallels, we talk about what it looks like right now, and you see a lot of people holding on to these old mentalities, right? The superiority complex that a lot of, you know, people have, and they tend to get, you know, feel more absolute in their feelings and in the way that they approach how the world should work. And it does a great deal of harm to, obviously, you know, everyone else. And that's, again, kind of vague as well. But I think it's just very interesting to see that written out in plain language, and to see that, even though it's in this fictionalized world, to just see that happening, and then thinking about like just how far we've come, but how far we have to go in regards to actually having some semblance of a reality or a society that actually reflects what the people who are being governed actually want. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Flim, I have a couple of. Oh, I'm sorry if someone wants to go.
Yeah,
Oh, no.
I wanted. Yeah, I felt like something worth adding to this narrative on like the consent of the people part, as with regards to how the topic is covered in the novel, is that from V's perspective, he isn't necessarily like that glowing of like, namely that like he is not only like overtly critical of the fascist regime he is fighting against, but he is also critical of the people themselves, and like this, like, you have this power. He goes like, you have this power. You have the people have the power to stand up and have your say in this social contract, and yet you don't.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And he's like, and the scary thing is that it's easy to see why. It's like you see so many, like, I mean, yeah, like it's established. It's like, yeah, it's a fascist police state, and it's like, once, if you ignore like the surveillance, if you ignore like how racial and like gender, sexual minorities have been stamped out of the society, ignore all that, and you just look at these people living their lives, there is this, you can kind of see why you can see the reasoning for that criticism from V. It's like, my own life's okay under the circumstances. Why should I care? And V is critical of that.
Absolutely. No, it definitely is still something that very much exists now, where people are just passive because it doesn't directly affect them, and then that being passive like that allows these things to just continue on when it's very clear that we, there's a consensus that we don't want these things. I agree with that. Burton, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, so there's one thing that I feel like is worth mentioning from just a historical context is we've been crediting a lot of Hallen's work to to the parallels of today, but from a historical context, and to give everyone a brief background, I'm real big into history and real big into philosophy. So I'm convinced of two things with Allen. I'm convinced he was a historian as well, and I'm convinced that he was a philosopher as well, just off of the content that is in the book, and then I'll kind of explain. So authoritarianism and fascism always go hand in hand. You can't really have one without the other. So what's interesting is, and one of the parallels that's made in the book that I really love is, it's all about controlling and stripping away the power of the individual. So to give context of this, a lot of people may not know this, but in medieval times, when everything was more of an equal playing field between the rich and the poor, what I mean by that is the rich would harvest all the resources from the poor, but one key thing is you could go out and hunt, or so you thought. You couldn't hunt because it was considered poaching the king's animals in the forest, even though the forest wasn't owned by anyone. So we've created these rudimentary laws, and we've just gone through a cycle consistently of revolution, and then a slip right back into authoritarianism and fascism, and then there's always key components to fascism and authoritarianism, and there's always an enemy, there's always an it, there's always some group, whether it be a minority, race-based, gender-based, ideology-based, there's always an enemy to attack. And you see that theme perpetrated throughout the entire book. And I would argue that the movie doesn't do that theme justice enough, because the book really it really hones in of how they segregated their society, how you had to believe what the state said, or else you didn't have a life, essentially. So I did want to point that out from historical context. Is I think what Alan did is he recognized this cycle humanity has gone through, generation after generation, and society after society, whether it be the Greeks, where they started off very authoritarianism, but then slipped into democracy and then collapsed, right? And the same thing happened to the Romans as well. I mean, so it's very interesting from a historical and a philosophical concept of why we see these trends. They always tend to go in a cycle. It's always it seems to be always one after another, and then to be living through it in modern history and seeing that shift from more of a democracy about 10 to 15 years ago, where people would try to work together, presumably, and then now everything is almost like, it doesn't matter what issue it is, everything's almost like a civil war within a civil war, if that makes any sense. Hopefully I made sense there.
No,
Yeah.
I think you did. Z? Were you about to say something?
Oh, no, I was just agreeing that it made sense.
For sure.
Yeah, to that, this cycle, I saw what you're speaking about a little differently, namely how how the fascist regime in the book came to rise as a result of a combination of destitute conditions brought about by nuclear war in the book's case, and a power vacuum created by said nuclear war.
Sure.
It's like London was reduced to a wasteland. There was no more government. people were left to fend for themselves, and that's just a power vacuum and a desperate population.
Yeah, and that I think it's perfect kind of
conditions
Sure.
for a fascist regime to rise up, because it just takes one power hungry person or group to like seize that, and of course people are otherwise decent human beings are more than willing to throw their freedoms and their principles away just for some stability in their life.
Yeah, I think it's
or
part
other people as well. They throw other people under the bus, right? So,
oh yeah,
exactly.
And that's scary too, especially considering, like we were talking about before, like the fact that what the world we're living in right now, right? I think a perfect, again, I keep using the word parallel. We should be throwing out a counter for that as well, Sleep. But I think
counter for fascism, counter
for parallel for sure is that idea that, like, right in the world we live in right now, in this post-COVID world, or we're still in the thick of it for a lot of people, but we are dealing with we're right on the verge of, if something were to happen and if we were to start to collapse, the people who have the power would enact a fascist police. It would make things even worse, right? Like the fictionalized fascist police state that we see in this novel is so close to what we could have in a similar situation today, which is just jarring.
Seeing our own elected officials trying to push it, even like we're at a breaking point with that, and you're seeing it in like the furthering political divides.
Sure, absolutely. Now I want to keep going here. I have a question that I wanted to ask real quick. So I'm gonna begin, and we're gonna start from the top and we'll work our way down. And I want to ask one of the questions that I found in the study guide, which is, in your opinion, did you find V to be a hero of the story, right? So Ben, I'm going to start with you. Did you find V to be a hero, and like why or why not?
Ooh, what a place for me to start. I did not like V.
Okay.
The torture scene was a bit much for me.
Sure.
I do think that with the stakes of this book and the people that he was going against being what it was, I feel like it needed to be that severe to really drive home the point. But as somebody said earlier, Alan Moore really likes to beat a dead horse.
Yeah, for sure.
I did enjoy these way of speaking. I love the theatricality of it. It was almost whimsical in like a morbid sort of way. So I really enjoyed that. But as far as hero, I mean, anti-hero, if anything.
Sure.
But I actually would love to, not to take away from that, but to kind of give my perspective if I'm going to be answering a lot of these questions.
Yeah,
first.
Absolutely.
There is an interview or like a foreword by David Lloyd, the artist, in the copy of the trade paperback that I read.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else saw that or had a chance to read that. But it discusses...
Mine has Alan Moore interviews instead of So
okay.
I'd love to hear what he has.
Right.
Sure. So it's an anecdote from him of a time that he's in a pub and the TV's on and he's drinking Guinness, so that's exciting. And it's going through this whole thing of like what's on TV, and then the news comes on and the TV gets turned off and he leaves. And then it ends with, there aren't many cheeky, cheery characters in V for Vendetta, and it's for people who don't switch off the news. And so that was the first thing I read.
Okay.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So for me, I was like, oh God, I shouldn't have read that because I live on cheeky characters and fun. And so I was like, okay, all right. I told Sleep Easy I would do this, so I got to do this, but the book just told me I shouldn't read it. So that was my perspective going in. With that being said, though, like I mentioned, I really enjoyed the speech choices that V used and the theatricality of the whole thing. But I would say anti-hero, if anything.
Absolutely. What about you, Burton? What do you think? V, in your mind, is V a hero? Why or why not?
Yeah, so Sleep's gonna roll his eyes when I say this, but yeah, I don't believe in
Can you
heroes
hear
and
it yet?
villains. I
Can you hear me
don't
rolling
believe.
my eyes at you
Oh
again?
my God.
Yes. Don't believe in heroes. Don't believe in villains. No one is perfectly good. No one is perfectly evil. Those are just stories we tell ourselves and about other people. So people are very nuanced. So I would agree, anti-hero for sure. Obviously, that's how he's presented out through the book. I would say that the book highlights a lot of themes I don't think that a lot of people kind of harvested from the material, or at least one of the things that stuck out to me, that torture scene that was mentioned, is very interesting to me because you see grotesque, extreme violence being done to the perpetrators of the said violence back to the people, right? So I would say that highlights an area to where, and we see this a lot in our culture, especially on the left. I'm going to assume everyone here is politically aligned to the left, like I am, obviously. But we see a lot of pacifism sometimes, and sometimes you got to fight fire with fire. And I'm a big believer in that. I'm all about like being nonviolent, but sometimes like if somebody is kicking in your door, I mean, responding with words isn't going to be enough. You know, like it's just not. Like you have to live reality and reality terms, right? So some ideas sound great, but in practice they're not great. So I say all that because, again, going back to the beginning of my first impressions, it had this darker, more realistic tone than the movie did. The movie was very theatrical. I loved it. It's still a good movie, but I feel like this really got into the nuance of who V was and why he did his decisions. Like we see him go to prison, which we see that in the movie, but how they expand upon that. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. Definitely anti-hero.
Anti-hero. Okay, cool. All right. Different way of coming to the same conclusion. But I okay, anti-hero for sure. What about you, Rocket?
If anything, anti-hero.
Sure.
And we keep coming back to citing the torture scene, and I feel like to answer this question, you really have to evaluate the V-Evie relationship and what that means to the characters and the story. Like,
so what do you mean?
To start with the torture scene, it's like I saw two interpretations of the torture scene and what that meant to those characters and their relationship. On one hand, I saw something of a and this is more comes out later, but the torture scene gets the ball rolling on this, where it's just like V has the notion is like, is he really a hero or is he not, or is he an anti-hero? I think he possessed it. It shows that point on. It shows that he has a self-awareness that he is not everything the people need. That there is like a need for there is a need for creators and a need for destroyers, and he is self-aware that he is a destroyer.
That's a great point, Rocket. Great.
And that the world will need, once he is done with his part, the world will need a creator. And he is positioning Evie to take on that role once V's role as the destroyer is complete.
I love that.
Evie embrace that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, and this is more specific to the torture scene, is it works from a story narrative, but I'm also like, especially with 21st century sensitivities, I'll just call it out bluntly for how I saw some of that, and how V was training Evie to be that. Oh, especially with the torture scene, I saw a lot of like tactics and such that we would refer to today as grooming, and I don't mean that in a positive way.
Yes, I agree.
100%. I love that.
Can I
More
respond to the
militarily, yes,
grooming?
absolutely.
Because I'm very curious about that. So when you say grooming, you're talking about like grooming the ideology and kind of how you should handle the fascists. Is that what you're referring to, Rocket?
No, just like he is like in a more like manipulative sense, like because Evie she starts the story 16 years old.
Right.
She is still.
And not even to mention like where she's at in her life at that age too. You know what I mean? Like it starts with her in such desperate straits that she is, you know, and that's. Go ahead. Sorry.
The movie avoids us by aging up the character,
Sure.
but I digress.
100%. I think that's definitely a big difference between them that I liked better. I guess is a rough way to put it, but the fact that she was that young and she was in that situation, and again, that's not to try to diss or put down sex work. Sex work's real work. We know this. This is a known entity for people who have any sort of rational thought, but in that situation, obviously, it's not the case, right? We find her at a very low point, and I think that was it's very important what you're saying. And Rocket, you're making you're making great points here, and it actually leads into another question that I'd like to ask. But before I do, I'd like to check in with Sleep and Z. I do want to get your answers there for: do you view V as a hero or not? And I don't.
Oh goodness. I think let me approach this in that people love anti-heroes, and I think that a lot of we want to. Ben can probably help me out with this because I'm not as well versed in DC as he is. But anti-heroes that come off the top of my head are Punisher, Venom. I'd even probably classify Sam Wilson in the new Captain America that came out in 2017. He's an anti-hero. I mean, he is Captain America, but he's also could be argued that he is a social justice warrior, which in my perspective is something that's good. But is an anti-hero because he is just like the Captain America, the Steve Rogers in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's trying to stand for what America should stand for, and not necessarily what it does, and that can make you an anti-hero. As far as echoing what everyone else said about the torture scene, I remember picking that up and reading it this last time and being like, oh well, shoot, I was really into V, but now I'm not so sure. But I think what Rocket said is nail on the head as far as that is concerned, in that you sometimes you need not need. Sometimes trial by fire is the way to get people on board to what you're doing. I don't think that that's necessarily right or wrong, but it is the way that Alan Moore tried to express the different sides of the story, right? So He kind of juxtaposes, supposed anarchy and fascism, and then in this, half of the book, right? Half of it is this middle section that has to do with the torturing of Evie, and it shows that hey, these tactics aren't necessarily all that different from who he's fighting against, right or wrong, right? So that's what I'll say about it. I don't. I'm going to answer your question by not answering your question, but I will take a shot back at Burton and say, hey, no gods, no masters. That also means no heroes.
Sure. I love that. What's that from? Is that from something?
It's just a saying. No gods, no masters.
I love it. So. Okay. Z, what do you think?
So I was trying to think back to what I remember about this movie.
Sure.
And two things stuck out to me. One, I hate this character. I hate him.
Okay. Absolutely. Tell me more.
I think the reason that I hate him.
Oh my goodness, he's so theatrical. It's hard for me to not like him.
That was my thing too. Sleep. He charmed me in moments where I felt uncomfortable. I was like, I hate that in this moment, this person who I do see as just like a objectively bad person, in a lot of ways, was like winning me over in moments that I just didn't like. Anyway, Z, continue. Sorry.
No, I understand the perspective, and it's okay that we have differing opinions, and I'm
not
saying that I'm right or wrong or anything like that.
No, that's the beauty of this whole thing.
Yeah, so there is different types of anti-hero, I guess. So there's one that I always think of when I think of V, and that's what they call the hero in name only, and that he's really he's a villain. He is.
Sure.
He's not really any different than who he's fighting against. The only difference is that he's slightly better.
Right.
And not by much. So I wouldn't. I know it's called an anti-hero, but I don't know. He's always kind of more like a villain to me. So
He's a Hino.
A Hino.
Hero in name only.
I love it.
Yeah.
Love a good acronym. No, I love that perspective. I think that you're right. I mean, you know, and that leads into a question that I was kind of thinking about too, and something I want to ask you guys is like one question that I had while I was reading this, while I'm, you know, exposing myself to all this, was like, is there such thing as a person who is so, like, because you also see in the novel and you also see in the movie, like, you know, V also has this their personal life is very much involved in this, right? There's a personal aspect of it, right, that influences their actions, and I feel like that's the case for just about anyone in a situation like that, or any, like, not to say that we're all capable of doing all these terrible things and torturing people in the same way and all that kind of stuff. Not to say that by any means, but the question for me was coming up is like, is there anyone who could spark or enact some sort of revolution, who could be a destroyer, as Rocket was talking about, right, in a way that is truly altruistic, right? Because we all know and kind of acknowledge, I feel like amongst us here, right, that there are things about the society we live in that are so wrong, right? Just inherently wrong. And there are people that are dealing with injustice day in and day out that shouldn't. And in order to change that system, when you try to do the little changes, a reform type approach, right, it doesn't work because you don't enact enough change and it just keeps things the same. Or you change little things, but you don't really change the root cause, the root problem. And so, like I was saying, the question that came up in my head, and I want to see your guys' perspectives on this, is like, is there a way to enact or spark some sort of revolution to change these things in a truly altruistic way with no personal vendetta, for lack of a better word, becoming involved in it? Does that make sense? Like involving your own personal goals and ambitions and not focusing on a revolution that actually focuses on what everyone wants. Does that make sense what I'm asking? And does anybody have any thoughts about that?
I just want to clarify the question. So you're asking, like, is there anybody who could spark a modern day like revolt? Is this a peaceful revolt? Is it a violent revolt?
It would be, I mean, a revolution in whatever means, right? Obviously, you would want to avoid. I feel like most people would want to avoid violence when you're enacting some sort of revolution or changing the system. But I feel like it's almost like, for me, and this is walking away reading this dark book that's talking about this, but it felt like it would be almost impossible to do that in a way without there being violence and with someone doing it in a way that's like just truly selfless, altruistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so my thoughts, unless you want to go in order again. We should probably just go in order.
We can. So Ben, do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh lordy. To that I would just say I feel like it would be very challenging to not have there be some sort of violence. I'm just gonna leave it at that. And
Sure.
I'll jump back in if somebody inspires me.
Okay. Yeah, and I think I tend to agree. But yeah, so Burton, what are you thinking? What are your
Challenge
thoughts?
accepted.
Okay, Ben, put me on the chopping block then. That's okay.
You're welcome.
It's fine. I'm used to being on the chopping block. It's fine. No, so I definitely think that we will see in our lifetime, we will see a revolution. It's just, if you follow the again, man, anytime I look at what's going to happen in the future, I always look at what happened in the past. And the reason is because human psychology doesn't change. Humans want and need the same things generation after generation. You're still going to have greedy people. You're still going to have very altruistic individuals. So we will see a revolution of some sorts because and with that, I do think we will see a destroyer. And the difference between, and this is where I think me and Z kind of diverge a little bit, is there has to be destroyers, and history has shown this. And this is why Alan put it in the book, and this is why I'm convinced he studied history, because we see destroyers time and time again. And they spark revolutions. You know, going back to the philosopher Socrates, he was stoned to death and killed for infecting the minds of the youth because he was telling them to rise up and basically eat the rich, right? And that ended up happening. So
Man, I've never been that stoned, but
yeah, no, same. I've not been. I mean,
I can
I've been
attest
stoned.
and say that I have been that
Uh,
stoned for sure.
I've been that stoned on shrooms, but that's a different. Oh, we're live. Oh well.
Yeah, it is what it is. It is what it is, baby. You know.
That's so funny. But no, so I do think that unfortunately, violence is necessary because your oppressors, they take everything by force. And
Absolutely.
unfortunately, it's not about if we have to use force or not. It's about once you gain the power, what do you do with it? Do you do what your oppressors did and you ostracize and you segregate communities and you do everything we're seeing in today's world and what every other basically civilization have done, or do we change the narrative? Do we finally have a collective? Do we finally have like real socialism or some form of social democracy that works for the people? And so that's kind of my thoughts on it is yeah, I think there's going to be violence. I think we're going to see that violence. I don't want it to happen, of course, but history does. I know people have heard this and I know people roll their eyes, but history truly does repeat itself because every generation thinks they're the best, every generation thinks they're the smartest, but we fall prey to the same fallacies, the same logical fallacies of racism and sexism and just hatred towards, groups we don't understand. And we see this a lot in the LGBTQ plus community of how they're ostracized and how they're literally demonized for just existing. And it's like until we move past that, until we move past all the identity of everything and attacking people for just their minor differences and I don't see a time where we're not currently here, and history has shown we're still slinging shit. It's just a little fancier and it's just a little shinier, if that makes any sense.
And there's more of it, I feel like, you know what I mean? Because we had the technology to shoot that shit a thousand times over rather than, or, shoot it to a million people rather than just, talking to somebody or handing out pamphlets. If that makes sense, right? For sure. There's a question. There's a part of this that I wanted to add, a little addition. In a situation where revolution occurs, right? And you kind of spoke about it, treating it like it's a certainty, Alex, and I think that's very interesting. In your mind, right? And everybody else, if you want to kind of put this seed in your ear and kind of think about it as well. What the symbol for V in the novel, right, is Guy Fawkes, right, and he's referring to the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, which was ultimately like a failed attempt to do the same things that he's trying to do in a similar way. What symbol, what person would you think a modern day revolutionary, someone is enacting a kind of revolution right now? What symbol are they using? What person are they wearing? What mask are they wearing? Or what are they using in order to kind of try to inspire the people of right now to get up and get something going?
I mean, I think the first thing I think of is probably V for Vendetta. Like the mask got popular and Anonymous really picked that up and they've done a lot of good work. And also I kind of look towards like Black Lives Matter as well, the collectivism, the activism that's been done there, and the organizing of local communities has been really cool to see. And I think if we do more of that, but on a larger scale, I think that's whenever we would see somebody. But as of right now, is there anybody in like politics right now?
And it doesn't necessarily have to be a person. A symbol could be something else, right? It could be an idea. It could be, I mean, you think about, and I'm, Ben, I feel like is the expert on this, but like you look at Batman being a symbol, right? The bat being the symbol in that sense. Like if it doesn't have to necessarily be a person, it could be an object. It could be anything. It could be a phrase. It could be anything like that. Yeah. Is there something that would be able to inspire, everyone?
Yes, my phrase is "eat the rich."
Sure.
And that's all I have put in.
Sure.
Ben might actually prefer the Superman S. I know that he's on the Brotherhood of Batman podcast, but not to divulge too much information, but I believe he prefers Superman, if I'm not mistaken.
I get it.
So this is why I was brought on here. Yeah,
I mean,
so
Calvin.
I definitely love the Batman idea. So I do a podcast where we read Batman books. And Batman is sort of an anti-hero. He's just not going to take the extreme violent approach. I don't know how relevant Batman would be to this actual
Sure.
question, but yeah, I definitely like Superman with his sunshine, and just the hope aspect,
Yeah.
whereas Batman is very much like desperate times call for desperate measures, which I think relates more to this.
Yeah.
There's
So with
actually a character I wanted to go back real quick when we were
Yeah.
talking about the anti-hero.
Sure.
Let's do it.
So this graphic novel was collected over time and is currently being published by the company Vertigo. Vertigo is like a little sister company of DC Comics.
Yeah.
And in the 90s, there was a character they were trying to popularize, literally named Anarchy. And that
Yes.
character would work a lot with Batman. And it really, I haven't read a ton of Anarchy, but he's like a teenager and he's less violent than V, but it definitely felt to me like DC's way of kind of riding the success and popularity of this book by having a more like superhero-y version that could interact with all their other characters in their world. So I just wanted to say that a little while ago when Ian was trying to drag the comic information out of me.
Oh, I love that. I didn't know anything about Anarchy, and now I'm gonna hyper focus on him for a little while.
Yeah, his mask
sure.
his mask is pretty cool and sort of similar to V, but obviously they had to change it enough for, legal reasons.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay, that's interesting too. That's very interesting. I'd love to know your thoughts about the James Gunn Superman movie. But we could talk about that another time, I think.
Yeah.
100%. But I'm not going to get into that. I'm really trying really hard right now to not get into that. So let's let's move right along here. So okay, Burton kind of talked about that a little bit. What about you, Rocket? Is there some sort of symbol, something that you feel like is a more modern day analogy? Now, obviously, and Burton kind of touched on it. The Guy Fawkes mask was one that was used right during Occupy Wall Street. It's already got its own touchstone in our own culture. But is there anything else? Is there anything that you could see also serving as a symbol to inspire people to revolt or to start some sort of revolution?
Symbolically, I really can't think of anything other than what's already been used. Oh,
Sure.
and we kind of got segued into the symbolism part, but it's to the earlier question of can such a revolution occur under led by somebody under more idealistic circumstances?
Yeah.
I feel this that plays a lot into a lot of the points with the thoughts I had with the previous question. This, and also this is as a whole, this was an interesting read for me at my current personal ideological evolution point, where right now one of the things I personally most struggle with ideologically is the pros and cons of reform versus revolution.
Sure.
And I've long been more, and still am to an extent, more of a proponent of reform because of to Benton's point of history repeating itself. I mean, because we've seen this through other historic revolutions where it's okay, revolution successful, power vacuum, now what? I mean, to use the French Revolution as an example, Napoleon happened shortly thereafter.
Sure. Yeah.
So my issue with revolution is okay, all right, it's just the what comes after. And I think one thing, and questionable methods aside, I think one thing V had right, and I'm happy this was addressed to some degree, is V had a self-awareness of that, and Evie was his countermeasure for that.
Sure. Explain a little bit more. What do you
earlier.
Right.
So, but to go back to the question at hand, I think it's you need that idealistic person. You need someone like that involved for the aftermath.
Sure.
Because you need I'm very you need the idealistic figureheads and then the people who do the dirty work behind the scenes, as well as an acknowledgement that sometimes some of the figureheads may have to pragmatically dirty their hands a little themselves behind the scenes, even if they put up a front of. I mean, and a lot of this mindset for me also comes from that I studied politics in college. My degree is in even though I'm not using it, I do possess a college degree, and it is in political science.
Sure. I feel like a lot of us can relate to having a degree that we don't use, for sure.
So it's no, and be it like standard politics or revolutionary politics. It's not something you get involved in with the expectation that you're going to keep your hands clean.
Sure.
That's just not how it works.
Yeah. I think it's a good point. I absolutely think it's a good point. Sleep, what do you think? Sleep and Z, I'd like to know, is there a symbol you think it would fall behind? Is there a way to do a revolution like this or to enact something like this? Rocket's bringing up a lot of good points, right? What do you do with that aftermath? What are your thoughts about what we're talking about right now?
Yeah, snaps for Rocket. That is the big discussion, right? Revolution or reform, and I probably have a particular bend over the other one. But what I will talk about that directly addresses the question, and probably kind of morphs it into something else, is that I think that people can be symbols, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Very obviously, the Guy Fawkes mask is a symbol, which is relating not, directly to V for Vendetta, but it's, largely to Guy Fawkes, who was trying to, bomb Parliament because he was not a fan of the Protestant, quote unquote revolution that was happening at the time and how they pushed out all the Catholics. As far as something else that we can draw on from the book, I would also say that V mentions that ideas are bulletproof. And I think that when we're talking about symbols or we're talking about ideas, we can kind of, I'm not so into muddying the waters all the time, but I think this time it seems appropriate because whenever we're thinking about symbols, especially in the context of the US, which all of us are living in, fortunately or unfortunately, is that when you think about certain political aspects, right? If we're thinking about Medicare for all, Bernie Sanders is a symbol. He's a person and a symbol.
Right.
And the Medicare for all, with people who, care about others, is an idea, and that seems pretty bulletproof. Because so many other...
On a more broader scale, those who have entered into politics motivated by what Sanders started, specifically those in the Congress that make up the gang, they've become symbols themselves, an extension of what Bernie started.
Absolutely. AOC, Nina Turner. Yeah. Absolutely. I really agree. Those are the people that in my world, I mean, obviously we all have our own different, I used it before, but that echo chamber of people that we are surrounding ourselves with. But for me, those symbols are those revolutionary types are people like Bernie Sanders or Nina Turner or AOC, those type of people that are speaking to Katie Porter, I would even say, is one of those people that are doing it in a way that I feel is a little bit more idealistic in the sense that they're trying to do it within the system, and they're trying that in a way they're trying to reform. I mean, not in a way, they are trying to reform the system rather than a revolt, but they do serve as those symbols for sure. I think you guys are dead on with that. Dead on. But I do want to kind of move these things along because I want to make sure that we keep things. I don't want to go over about an hour and a half. I figured about an hour and a half, everybody's time was good. So I want to make sure we kind of jump here pretty quickly into final thoughts. I wanted to see. Actually, that's exactly what we're going to do. So what I like to do is just kind of go around again and just ask everybody any sort of final thoughts they want to share about the book itself, about what it means for the world we live in now, that type of thing. So we'll work our way from the bottom up. We'll end with Ben this time. We keep putting Ben at the front here. Let's let him end things for us. But Z, in your mind, are there any sort of final thoughts that you have on the movie compared to the conversations we're having about the graphic novel?
The movie is clearly very watered down. I don't remember this torture scene. I don't remember a nuclear war. Like,
Sure.
I don't remember any of this stuff.
Yeah, there are definitely things that that Hollywood kind of painted over for sure. Much to more chagrin.
It's kind of sad.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad though, but I understand. Like, they got to keep their ratings, whatever. But
Right.
It would have been, I think, a very different movie had we had those moments in there.
Absolutely.
So I'm actually really interested to check out the book and see really what the story is.
I love that. It's not every day that you have a book club meeting where the person walks away from it and goes, "Hey, I definitely want to read this book." I love that. I love that. Cool. Okay, Sleep. What about you? Any sort of final thoughts that you have? Or Z, I'm sorry. Were you finished with the thoughts that you had? I apologize.
No, yeah,
Okay.
that I mean, that's all I had.
Okay, awesome. Sleep. What are your thoughts, man? What are your final thoughts?
All right, I'm gonna go all over the place. I
Okay.
think that yet again, and at some point we're gonna get to a spot where, with previous reads in our previous iteration of book club, may not necessarily think well, but I think this goes with all the other things that we've read, from manufacturing consents to the silence of our friends.
Sure.
To, some of the other things we've read in a previous iteration of book club all kind of align with what is going on here. So I do want to kind of bring that up ever so slightly. I do also want to shout out I mentioned Easter eggs earlier. I love that in like some of the final pages of the book, Les Miserables makes an appearance. I think
Sure.
that's really cool.
Yeah.
I think it's also really neat that, as far as Easter eggs are concerned, I don't know if this was particularly Alan Moore. I know that this has been giving weight to Alan Moore a little bit more heavily than the other authors, but mentioning what was it that he says? Oh, the reports of my death was an exaggeration. I believe it's not V that says it, it's Evie that says it.
Mhm.
But that is straight from Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, that says that particular thing historically. And I love how that is put in the book as well. There's lots of different things in there, but those specifically are really neat kind of historical Easter eggs, as Burton would probably say. Wanted to point out some of the philosophical and historical aspects to this. I know that Rocket mentioned Margaret Thatcher, which is exactly why Alan Moore wrote this. There was certainly a type of oppression that was going on in the 80s underneath Margaret Thatcher, and also in the U.S. with Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
We've brought up the LGBTQ plus community, and as far as Reagan is concerned, in the 80s, we all know what was happening then. So yes.
Absolutely. I love everything that you have to say right there. Rocket, do you have any final thoughts, my friend?
I mean, to Slate bringing up like how this is rooted in the criticisms of Thatcher and by extension Reagan, and a lot of what we see politically today, a lot of the groundwork was set by the rise of those two individuals. So it's not surprising we see so many parallels, because it's like we're just dealing with we're dealing with what they started being pushed to a greater extreme.
Sure.
Also, outside of that, I really think all like thematically with regards to like V as a character and his story has been said. I would like, however, quickly bring up how the story in the book ended up portraying a lot of the other characters, like the leader being presented as such a pathetic individual behind his grandiose presence that he presents himself with. That I felt like that was a fitting juxtaposition.
Sure. Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah, the strong man isn't all that strong.
Right.
yeah. Also, like, just the whole hero, villain, anti-hero as the greater people, like, it really felt like, in terms of, like, actual, like, who felt like were redeemable, like, or like had people with redeeming qualities behind everything. There were really only 3 people in this story that I felt had like some semblance of like, these are deep down good people, even if 2 of my 3 examples clearly lost their way.
Sure.
And Evie is obviously one of them. The other 2 is Finch, the detective, where he
Oh yeah.
complicit, but it's like as the story progressed, he was kind of waking up to his own reckoning of was this worth it?
Right. Becoming disillusioned
And-
there at the end like that. That was yeah, I thought that was a very interesting arc for him.
And the doctor character, who accepted her fate in a way where she's like, the deeds I have committed, I deserve this.
Right. Absolutely. No, that was I thought that was one of the more beautiful scenes too of the entire book with the apology. I forget the exact way it was phrased in there, but I loved the way that was set up. That was a beautiful moment, I thought.
Yeah, very poignant way to
yes.
put, like, even things that we talk about today, whether it's Nazis or cops or anyone who is put in a position to where you're supposed to follow orders. Like, that's something that, gets talked about to this day is, okay, well, is this person evil because they did an evil thing that they were told to do? Or maybe is there nuance? So yeah, as I said previously, hitting over the head with certain ideas is something that happens in particular books written by Alan Moore.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Okay, Rocket, I appreciate that. So I'm just gonna briefly say any sort of last thoughts that I have. I think that part of V's talking about like everybody is a hero, a villain, all these different types of things, and Burton, you kind of touched on it too, is like trying to find the person that you're dealing with, right? You may look at somebody as a villain, but trying to see past that a little bit and trying to see the person. For some people, that's really hard, right? And for one parallel that I kept looking into, and whenever I was growing up, I was a super evangelical person. I've since then changed my way of thinking, and I find myself to be more of an ex-evangelical type of person. But if that makes sense, but the actual persecution versus perceived persecution is such a big part of this conversation. The way that people and I'm not trying to just say one religious community over another. I'm just trying to speak to my own personal experience, is that you find people look at themselves, look at their lives as if they're being persecuted. And when they do that, they lash out that much more against people who are actually persecuted. And the idea that, we have these 2 people fighting against each other, often just for me, it's depressing and dark, and I struggle a lot to try to find that peace. And we talk about this, and I'm kind of going off. I apologize because I'm going off on a tangent that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But just to say that you see people who are actually being persecuted, who are actually dealing with societal structures that are working against them. And then you have the people who are setting up those structures, believing without any sort of doubt that they're the ones being persecuted, is such an interesting aspect of this whole conversation. And such an interesting part about, I think, the book, and like going forward, like what do we do to try to change that narrative or try to fix that? It seems like a huge mountain to climb, but one that I think that is going to eventually, be overcome. But anyway, Burton, what are your final thoughts?
I kind of wanted to piggyback off of what Rocket said. He brought up a really good point of how the way they positioned the leader is like basically behind closed doors. This leader is just awful. Like, is not a strong person. Not And that kind of draws parallels when you look at authoritarian regimes and fascist regimes. The three that kind of really stuck out when he was talking about like weak leaders, or I should say four, would be you look at Vladimir Putin, very weak individual from a like can't take criticism. Same with Xi Jinping. He banned Winnie the Pooh from being shared in China because people are saying he looked like Winnie the Pooh. So,
Sure.
and then you see Kim Jong Un as well, North Korea. Everybody knows all three of these countries. You can't share anything about their leaders that is degrading, and that just speaks volumes to their insecurity. And same with Trump, right? When Trump was in office and we saw the Twitter files got released, the conservatives wanted to go on a tirade about how the left was trying to censor everyone. Whenever they had twice as many inquiries, the conservatives did, about trying to censor tweets that were about politicians or about Trump or about his cabinet, and they were trying to get those tweets removed. So going to your point as well, Flemma, of like you have two groups who both feel like they're being persecuted, so they both feel justified in doing whatever they need to do to get the job done. Essentially, it's a very interesting position to kind of observe from the outside, but also from the inside as well, because we're all living through this. So yeah, it kind of leaves me a lot to think about.
And it's obviously too there's a lot of coming from a privileged perspective as well, right? We're able to talk about these things from the outside, but there are so many people who obviously can't, right? And that's a big part of this as well. What were you about to say, Rocket?
I just wanted to cite two other examples of what Burton is referring to. The first being less government, but nonetheless, this applies here. Elon Musk.
Sure.
Especially with how he's been handling Twitter.
Right. I mean, right now, is he not the voice in a way, or the mouth, or yeah, in a way, he definitely is. That's our modern day version of it, right?
And an example that just nail meet hammer to this exact point.
Sure.
Adolf Hitler himself.
Yep.
Sure. Absolutely.
Well, that's why Prothero worked so well as the voice, right? It wasn't just that he was the voice of London; it was because he's previous military, right?
Right. And you see that a lot now, right? You see a lot of former military people now in different roles. You know, they leave the military, they go into roles where they are policing us in other ways. They are, they are the moderators on social media, right? They are those people that are trying to be like, hey, if you say something that is, anti or is some sort of revolutionary rhetoric, you're going to get far more shut down, right? If you're speaking to an injustice that's happening, right? But it doesn't fit the narrative that's wants to be told by the government, by those who are overseeing these things, or the Elon Musks, right? They are skilled in being able to shut you down in ways that are just devastating, right, and thorough.
Or they hold the power, because
right.
As much as what Burton was bringing up, as much as a certain type of person wants to complain about how they're censored online, really, if you look to the other side, it's indigenous peoples and other people who are not necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily consider them revolutionary perspectives. But some people do, and that is why their perspectives get taken offline. That's why their profiles get banned. And unfortunately, a lot of those voices aren't as large as some of the other ones that want to complain about censorship, right?
Yeah. I think that's such a good point. How you define what revolution is, or how they try to define what a revolutionary is, it feels like they're trying to force a narrative to stay a certain way. Again, I don't want to go too far into it, but you could look into the Roe v. Wade situation, that whole conversation we were having, right? And just how we keep repeating the same things over and over and over again, because it's easier for them to focus that narrative on these certain things instead of us just all, like you're saying, it's not a revolutionary thought process to realize that people exist, you know what I'm saying? Or like that they have been a huge part of our culture, but instead we got to make sure that narrative isn't talked about, and that is defined as a revolution, those simplistic building blocks, right? So that way it doesn't grow any further. It doesn't become, we don't get any more sort of real momentum going. For sure. So, okay, with that being said, so Ben, what are your final thoughts about V for Vendetta, about the conversation that we're having overall?
Yeah, you all made some really great points. I'm really, really glad that I got the chance to do this, because this is a book I've known about, but one I never would have read unless I got to talk about it with people and then listen to myself talk about it later.
Sure.
So it's definitely still relevant, as everyone said. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I thought it had, I don't know, style-wise, not my favorite, but I'm glad that I got to be a part of this. I think you all made some really great points.
Absolutely. I agree for sure. Well, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I appreciate you all for joining in. Again, you all, like Ben said, you guys brought in some amazing perspectives, some great things to kind of think about and kind of chew over in the future. And I'm very excited, obviously, for what we could have ongoing when it comes to what this book club is. Like, obviously, next month, that's what I'm thinking about as well. So with that, I'm going to kind of close things up a little bit. I want to make sure if anyone wants to kind of shout out, anybody who's active. So Ben, I would like if you would start just kind of shout yourself out. Like, where can people find you? Where can they listen to what you have to talk about? I do have the Brotherhood of Batman podcast here on my Twitch showing if you want to subscribe there. But is there anywhere else that they can find you specifically, Ben?
Sure, thank you. So yeah, Brotherhood of Batman, you can find it anywhere that podcasts are available. I also do some podcasts about canceled CW TV shows. There's one called What's New Nancy Drew, where we do weekly recaps, my friend Sarah and I, about that show. And then also the short-lived Tom Swift, which is very queer, very black, and it's a little sci-fi, so that's fun. And that is called A Swift Review, a Tom Swift recap podcast.
I'm gonna write
and then
this
if you
down in
just
the
want to
chat.
look at my beautiful face, you can go to BBW Sunshine 86 on Instagram.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Be sure.
Thank you so much for having me, you guys.
Oh, of course. Thank you for joining us, Ben. Make sure you follow Ben. I think that you'd be really excited. Anybody here would love to hear what he has to say. And I'm very interested in what was called. What was it again? I want to put this in the chat. What was it? The Swift podcast?
Yeah, it's a Swift review, a Tom
review.
Swift recap podcast.
Okay.
My co-host Sarah and I had the pleasure of getting to speak with 2 of the creators and 6 members of the cast. It's a 1-season-long show. I think you can find it on HBO now.
Okay.
It started on CW and was canceled when they started quelling all of the shows that had any sort of minorities in it. So definitely a fun show with some serious, relevant topics. And yeah, not that you have to listen to me, but the interviews we got to talk with the creators were really cool.
Oh, absolutely. That sounds super interesting. Awesome. Make sure everybody who's here, hang out, chat with them for sure. Nancy Drew. Yes, absolutely. The Nancy Drew podcast as well. Love it. All right, folks. Well, is there anybody else who wants to kind of give a shout out of anything, anywhere we can find you guys online or, talking to you? Sleep, I know you can find Sleep at the Sleep Easy, but is there anything that you want to speak to yourself?
Not particularly. I'm the Sleep Easy cross-platform. You can find me Rustling Feathers on Twitter, the Garbage Heap. That's typically where I am. I'm also pretty active in the Discord as well, so I'm the one that runs the book club polls. I might expand out from the Discord, but if you're interested, Flimmerverse's Discord is where I do that. So
awesome. And that's where I'll kind of, anybody else want to plug themselves, anything that they're doing right now that they're excited about, that they want to share with the world. That's okay if not. I'm excited about you guys and I love you guys. I'll say this, for me, if you have the time, if you have a brief moment, feel free to follow me here on twitch.tv/Flimmerverse. I believe I'll also be posting this up on YouTube as well, so that everybody can, whoever couldn't catch it today can catch it at a later time. But otherwise, what I'm looking forward to, I got to make sure to shout out Gravy, Young Gravy for JJ here in the chat, just because she said it, and I want to make sure that she gets some love too.
Flemma.
Yeah.
How do I find you on Twitch? I'm trying to create a Twitch account so I can follow you.
Yeah, so I'm at twitch.tv/Flimmerverse. And that's FLEMMAVERSE. I was called Flemma in high school and just thought it was a fun little name to stick with.
Dude, you're on Google.
Hey, that's cool. Find me on Google.
You got an ad playing as well.
That's something. Anyway, so I'm really excited. Next week for book club, we are going to be reading The End of Policing. Like Sleep said, I know there's a lot of people who are really excited about reading this as well. We're hoping to get someone on to talk about it, to do an interview with about the book itself. But we are still in working that out, making sure that schedules can align and all that. But otherwise, please join us March 26th, 11 a.m. We're going to talk about that book as well. Otherwise, that's it for me. I appreciate you guys here in the Discord for hanging out with us, and everybody here on Twitch. Thank you for hanging out, for talking with us, for being part of this conversation. This has been the first episode of Book Club. Thank you very much.